This week on The Wheelhouse. Shadow networks and their influence. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse, the show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond right here. You don't have to live and breathe politics to know about the NRA or Planned Parenthood. These organizations, they influence our democracy in big and small ways, and they're pretty public about it. But what about those organizations that operate more in the shadows? I'm talking about the ones you don't really hear about. Sometimes these organizations, the shadowy ones, have just as much influence as the household names and have actually been around for decades. So why don't we know about them? And what do they mean for our democracy? Here to break all that down is someone who literally wrote the book on this, Ann Nelson, author of Shadow Network, Media, Money, and the Secret Hub of the Radical Right. Good morning, Ann. How are you today?
Good morning, Frankie. I'm happy to be talking to Connecticut.
How would you define shadow political organizations or shadow networks? What or who are we talking about here?
Well, you mentioned my book, and I talked in the book about one of the leading umbrella organizations, which is called the Council for National Policy. And if you've never heard of it, that's on purpose. They chose the most boring name they could imagine. And for 40 years, conduct their meetings in secret. They coordinate major donors like the DeVos family of Michigan and coordinating with the Koch brothers operation from fossil fuels to gradually achieve a right-wing takeover of the Republican Party and, by extension, the country itself.
We're talking about organizations that hold meetings in secret memberships, often funded by dark money. Really shadowy stuff here.
What they're really seeking is minority rule. They've been pushing regressive policies like these extreme abortion laws we're seeing in some states, where women with ectopic pregnancies can't get life-saving procedures in hospitals because doctors are living in fear. You're getting these anti-trans measures where people are deprived of medical care because of their gender choices. Gun laws, it goes on and on. And most of the policies they're promoting are not supported by public opinion in the country. So they found other mechanisms to deal with loopholes in our political system and exploit them to achieve these minority policies that are actively hurting people.
Help me with this. How do these shadowy organizations like the CNP differ from things like political action committees or even lobbyists?
So a lot of the PACs political action committees, work under federal law. They have certain disclosure rules, federal requirements for donors and so on. Both the Republicans and the Democrats have some entities called donor advised funds, where donors can contribute money to a pool that's then assigned to projects and organizations without tagging it to the individual donors. So yes, both Republicans and Democrats have these groups. The Koch network has a huge complex of them. The National Christian Foundation is a right-wing fundamentalist donor advised fund. But where it differs is that these are connected directly to a whole set of machinery that involves political strategists. It involves their own dedicated media platforms that present themselves as journalism, but they're just basically advertising their policies and their candidates. And so they work much more like a coordinated corporation, whereas the Democrats don't have, the Democratic Party media system. The strategists are not closely linked to the entire complex of media and donor and grassroots organizations. It's much looser and less strategic, and ultimately often less effective.
And they can side of these conservative groups, at least, they can sort of fly under the radar, as I understand it, as churches.
Yes, in fact, a lot of times they will even be organizations with an overt political agenda, such as the Family Research Council, which is one of the core organizations of the Council for National Policy. And under IRS rules, they're designated a church. Now, they have an office, they have a political media show on multiple platforms called Washington Watch. And when a reporter challenged them and said, well, in what respect are you a church? They said, oh, well, we count our board meetings as church services. But, they work closely through fundamentalist churches, especially in battleground states in the Midwest. They put voter guides in the church bulletins, right? Like right next to the hymns and the sermon. And by the way, the sermons they have online, and the pastors can download the sermons and deliver them without doing any work. They organize voting registration and transportation to the polls for Republican inclined voters only, straight out of the church parking lot. So to call this exclusively a religious as opposed to a political organization, strange credulity.
Everything you're talking about here really brings up this idea of money and its influence on politics, right?
Well, yeah, it does. And, I think that, none of us can get inside the minds of the founders, but I do think that they were looking at individual voters as having some say in the system. And by the time you get mega corporations giving mega donations, and many of them secret, to candidates as a form of a lobbying interaction, I can't imagine that's what the founders had in mind.
2010, the Citizens United Supreme Court decision, as I understand it, it might have changed the landscape of money's influence on politics. Maybe it gets even deeper at that point.
Absolutely. And you had really concerned political figures on both sides, certainly John McCain and various others, who said this is really detrimental to American political life because it really takes the vote away from the voter. And by the time you get these millions and millions of dollars sloshing through the system, let's just say that the people who run these corporations have, an infinite amount of additional power compared to John Q. Public. And that has played out in many ways. You can look at the way our tax system has evolved to benefit the wealthiest 1% to the detriment of the bottom 50%. You look at the erosion of support for public education, public universities, the arts and the public life, public libraries, the list, public health, the list goes on and on. And, the idea of these plutocrats is that they don't want their profits spent on the well-being of their fellow citizens. I would argue that's not the American way.
What first got you personally interested in really investigating this idea of shadow politics, and when?
Yeah, I had spent most of my career looking at international relations. I was a reporter for the wars in El Salvador and Guatemala. Then I worked for human rights. And I got very involved in freedom of information and the way information is distributed in societies. And so, like 30 years or so in this field, teaching at Columbia and elsewhere. Fast forward to 2000s, and I'm in my home state of Oklahoma, and I am driving to Walmart because that's what you do in Oklahoma. And I turn on the radio, and there's this rant from a preacher that says that if John Kerry is elected president and you have marriage equality, it will make traditional marriage obsolete. So these call-ins came in from these poor, worried people. I've been married to my husband for 45 years, but my marriage will be obsolete. And it's like, yes, ma'am, that's what John Kerry will do. I thought, what on earth is this? I mean, it was crazy talk. And I found out what the radio station was, and then over a period of time, I found that the station was connected to a network, which was run by a member of the Council for National Policy, and there were three such networks involving hundreds and hundreds of stations that they owned and thousands of stations that distributed their coordinated content that was highly political, had nothing to do with fact-based journalism. And I thought to myself, oh dear, my fellow citizens are being taken for a ride. So when I started investigating it, that led to all of these other organizations that have really come to prominence over the last 5 years.
How much of these shadowy organizations actually influence our democracy? What's their scope?
I would say that a lot of their influence went under the radar for many years. But in 2016, in June, they cut a deal with Donald Trump. They had a big meeting at a Times Square hotel in New York City and brought 1,000 of their fundamentalist leaders from around the country to meet with Trump. And they made a deal. Now, a lot of these pastors and fundamentalists thought that Donald Trump was a sinful man. He was not their cup of tea, and they were indeed, many were never Trumpers. But their leadership argued that Trump could achieve their goals, whereas other Republican leaders had not. So the trade-off was that at that point, June 2016, Trump had won the primary seasons, but he didn't have a war chest. He didn't have a ground game. He didn't have political strategists. He was a reality TV star. And these guys had all three of those components and could bring them to the Trump campaign in return for Trump drawing on their list of candidates for the federal judiciary appointments and having them as his nominees, which would then shape the federal judiciary on every level to their liking to a degree that we'd never seen before. And the three organizations that were designated for this selection process were the Federalist Society, the Heritage Foundation, and believe it or not, the National Rifle Association. And indeed, when the first nomination went through under the Trump administration, he invited the leaders of these organizations to the White House for a victory celebration. So in that respect, with these appointments that tilted the Supreme Court, they achieved an incredible advance of their goals. But they also had these court appointments on the other levels of the federal judiciary. So they've tilted several of the national circuit courts in their direction. They've also purged moderate Republicans from Congress and from state office. And of course, you know, Connecticut has a proud tradition of moderate Republicans who know how to work for the common good. So many of these people have been purged from the Republican Party, driven out mercilessly. And we're talking about Don Boehner. We're talking about Jeff Flake. They had no love for John McCain. So they took over the Republican Party to a degree where traditional Republicans don't even recognize it anymore. And what they're gunning for, and I use that term advisedly, in 2024 is to take over Congress, the White House, and complete their takeover of the courts. In which case, there would be very little standing between the United States and a virtual dictatorship.
You can't see my face when I'm saying this, but you've called this arrangement between CNP, Trump, you've called this I'm winking, art of the deal?
Yeah, I thought that was kind of cute.
Not to get too meta, but I'm a journalist and think a lot about the role the news media has in all this. You kind of just outlined this just a little bit, but give us a bigger taste. How are these shadow political organizations able to leverage the media?
Well, I think that our tribe of journalists bear some of the responsibility, certainly in terms of media owners, because some 20 years ago, as you know, as well as I do, we had an economic crisis in professional journalism in this country. You had online technology biting into hometown newspapers and their advertising model. You had the economic problems of 2008 that were another severe blow to news organizations. And the ones on the coast, especially the East Coast, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and some others, managed to innovate their way through that particular crisis and are doing okay. But out in the Midwest, where I come from, you have over 1,000 counties where there's no journalism organization at all, zero. So what happened when you had the die-off of professional journalism, fact-based reporting in these places, is that it created a vacuum that was filled by these right-wing evangelical and right-wing talk radio shows. These are states where people drive around a lot in cars because there were big distances, and they turn on the radio. These stations blanket many states, and especially these include a lot of battleground states where national elections are won or lost by 1 or 2 percentage points. So they have an effect. Now, add to that what they call Christian broadcasting. There are lots and lots of Christians who would not identify these outlets as recognizably Christian, but the Christian Broadcasting Network, the Trinity Broadcasting Network, have audiences in the millions, and they replicate the political advertising that is contained on these radio networks. And then recently, you've got this huge proliferation of online platforms that replicate it, often with the same spokespeople, same disinformation, even the same terminology. So it's not something that I see from my vantage point in New York City or when I come to Connecticut. But when I go to Oklahoma and Nebraska and the states, the impact is tangible.
Is this a more recent phenomenon, or how far do these date back, these kind of shadowy organizations and getting involved with politics?
Well, the Council for National Policy and its radio operations date back, like 30, 40 years. The online proliferation is really, over the last decade or so, because, it tracks technology. And their superpower is that a lot of their operations take place in areas that the national media doesn't really examine. There was a crucial election, for example, in Missouri with Claire McCaskill that I document in my book, where you had the Democrats and the Democratic Party of Missouri campaigning for Claire McCaskill, and the Republicans campaigning for Josh Hawley, who is somewhat a creation of this network. And then you had this third element, which is the canvassing that was done by partner organizations of the Council for National Policy, such as the National Rifle Association, doing political canvassing door to door, such as the Susan B. Anthony anti-abortion organization. And they're equipped with state-of-the-art political data and campaign technology. And they're not really covered by the media because they go under the radar. But if you look at the number of interactions with voters, it's a massive effect. And guess what? Josh Hawley won, and he's been exerting his influence ever since.
You focus a lot on the more conservative shadow political organizations, but do we also see some more progressive ones too?
Well, as I said earlier, there are donor-advised funds on the left. There are major donors who find ways to contribute dark money to campaigns. So it's not an entirely one-sided operation. But if you don't include the way that the dark money is integrated into these media operations and these political operations and what are called, a lot of times the media will call their mass organizations grassroots when they're actually AstroTurf. Right. So if you don't understand that coordination, you miss most of the story. It's not just the money. And certainly in recent times, it's been argued that the Democrats technically have more money. But I think that you could also prove that they have far less coordination. So let me give you an example. You've got something called the Leadership Institute, which is another core organization of the Council for National Policy. They claim now that they have trained over 270,000 conservative political candidates, campaign workers, campaign communications people all over the country. I did some research on them before the 2020 campaigns. They went into some 40 or 50 counties in Texas over a year before the election to start training people, right? So the Democrats don't have anything resembling that. And then when you train that number of people and you start feeding them into internships on Capitol Hill, and you start feeding them into their regional radio stations, right? You create this massive ability to conduct coordination. Then they create these organizations, and they really manage to brand them and shift them with the tides. So right now, you may have heard of the Tea Party from 2010. That the co-founder of Tea Party Patriots, Jenny Beth Martin, is a very active member of the Council for National Policy, but we're not talking about Tea Party anymore. The new kids on the block are Moms for Liberty, who disrupt school boards and cause all kinds of trouble for teachers and parents and administrators in public schools. Now they're a partner organization of the Leadership Institute, right? And that connects them with major donors and connects them with this activist local base to achieve this coordination that looks like, oh, all of these parents in this school for some reason decided to disrupt proceedings in exactly the same way that other parents in Florida and California did. Well, you don't have to look very far to find that there are online trainings from the Leadership Institute and the Family Research Council on how to disrupt your school board, right? So it's coordinated. Same thing with Turning Point USA. The person who runs it is a member of the Council for National Policy. The seed funding came from a donor from the Council for National Policy. So, these organizations work in various degrees of legality and various degrees of ethics. But what so much of the media does not recognize are these levels of coordination among the donors, the activists, the board members. It's all laid out in the documentation.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. More on shadow politics coming up. Stick with us. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. This hour, we're looking at shadowy organizations that have an outsized impact on our democracy. Still with me here is Ann Nelson, author of Shadow Network, Media, Money, and the Secret Hub of the Radical Right. We've been talking about the Council for National Policy, and I want to zoom in now a bit more on its effect on the modern American political landscape. Just how far-reaching is this organization, Ann, and who has ties to it?
Well, one thing that I talk about in my book is this regional distinction. And a lot of its power and money is concentrated in what I call the American petrostates. And I was highly aware of this being from Oklahoma and seeing the power that fossil fuels have in state politics. It's also true in Texas and Louisiana. And a very high degree of the leadership, the founding members of the Council for Policy, come from the fossil fuel territory. And some of the religious organizations that are affiliated with them in these states, especially the Southern Baptists. So one thing that you've seen is this kind of transfer of power and influence, as I said, from the moderate Republicans of the past. Many of them were from the Northeast. Many of them were from the Rust Belt, right? Because you had some strength in the unions that were supportive of the Democratic Party. Well, one thing that this organization did, or its core members, was go after the unions. So the DeVos family has been one of the most important donor entities in the Council for National Policy. And they spent millions and millions of dollars going after the unions in Michigan and making it a so-called right-to-work state, which limited the abilities of the unions. And Betsy DeVos, from the same family, was basically the secretary of anti-education under Trump. And she continues to spend millions of dollars attacking teachers' unions and trying to limit them in any way she can. And they've had some significant success in various places. So, that touches so many Americans' lives. It's like, I don't understand why you would want to disrupt and degrade public education. You would think that is something that would be considered a public good. But I think one of their issues with it is that it costs money. And if you tax the extremely wealthy class at the percentage that the rest of us pay, that's a lot of money, and they'd rather not have it go for other people.
The DeVos family you mentioned, but also the Koch brothers, who are they? Wayne LaPierre, people might know him from the NRA. He's involved in CNP. Who else?
The Koch brothers have not been members of the CNP, but Charles Koch was awarded the DeVos Prize by the CNP. And what you see is a lot of cross-funding. The CNP is heavily fundamentalist Christian. Koch brothers have no identifiable religion other than possibly worshiping Mammon. So what they do is they fund each other's enterprises, and that's all totally documented in tax forms and other federal documents that are linked to in my book. That's not open to question. The other donors include the late Foster Friess, who was a right-wing fundamentalist from Wyoming. Another major player is the Bradley Foundation. The Bradley Foundation is based in Milwaukee. The head of it is a member of the Council for National Policy. They have funded a lot of exercises in election denial. And one of their board members is a lawyer named Cleta Mitchell, who was heavily involved with Trump's attempts to overturn the election. She was on the call with Brad Raffensperger, the famous call where Trump said, just find me 11,000 votes somewhere. So they work on multiple fronts at once. And I see evidence that, there's a kind of plan A, plan B, plan C approach. If this doesn't work, we'll try that, and then we'll try this, and then we'll try that. And I see Moms for Liberty and Turning Point USA as pre-gaming for the 2024 elections.
We've been talking a lot about the CNP's influence on our national politics, but I'm curious if its influence trickles down to the local level too. What can you tell us about that?
Well, they are very active in, as I said earlier, training and positioning networks of candidates at a local level. So, for example, one reason that I care so much about public school boards is that they can also be a pipeline for political office. You can go from school board to local precinct chairman to, city council to state representative. And so they've looked at every level of American political life and tried to infiltrate it with their own people. And at the same time, as I said, purge the moderates, purge the people who have a constructive attitude about working with others. So they've also had people attend their secret meetings from the constitutional sheriffs of America, where they try to place their supporters in positions or cultivate county sheriffs across the country. And of course, this is a very delicate situation because they could conceivably have oversight of polling places. They could have, we know they have some connection to militia organizations.
Can they influence local school board elections?
Yes, absolutely. So the Council for National Policy and the Leadership Institute both conduct trainings on how to take over your school board. Yeah, and I went online and I looked at the training materials, and they're national and they're online. And so it's a way of and of course they can activate the graduates from the Leadership Institute. So yeah, it's highly coordinated. And of course, I've been in touch with some of these parents in Virginia and California, and these poor parents don't know what hit them, because they expect to go to a school board meeting and talk about how to teach math in 5th grade. And then they get attacked with these insults and these threats of violence. And it got really, really nasty in Virginia, where they were leaving dead rats on doorsteps and vandalizing cars, right? And it's like, this is a school board. What is going on, right? So these coordinated activities are really destructive to our communities, and they're happening in multiple states. Turning Point USA, which works in partnership with the Leadership Institute, has a McCarthyite website. There's one that says, that's Professor Watch. And if your professor says something liberal, like, oh, let's think about feminist economics, the students are supposed to rat them out on the website. And by the way, a lot of the people that they report are people of color and women. So Turning Point USA has now a partner website, which is School Board Watch. And if they feel that a school board or a school district doesn't want to ban books about race and gender according to their prescription, then you're supposed to report them to this website. So yeah, it's a highly networked operation, and it's highly destructive.
I want to go fast forward to 2024. What can you see as a possible role that organizations like CNP could play in the presidential election? And do you have any advice for listeners trying to kind of sift through all this?
I think that we will have to look very carefully at what happens at polling places. One of their maneuvers is to try to prevent university students from voting, because they tend to trend Democratic. So they have come up with all kinds of arguments for blocking students from voting, including not having polling places on campuses. We've seen this in a number of states. And it's important to just be preemptive and try to see where the polling places are blocked or limited or shut down, and try to make the argument for Americans' right to vote on as broad a basis as possible. That's really going to count for a lot. And ultimately, I really, really believe in participatory democracy. We cannot take it for granted. I'm not making a case for the Democratic Party. I'm making a case for democracy with a little d. Their right to vote, elect our government, the principle of one man, one vote, even though we're not quite there yet. And so that means run for office. That means vote. That means support fact-based journalism in your community and look across state lines to states that have bigger challenges and find ways to support democracy for our fellow citizens living elsewhere. This is a year where, the actions of individual citizens will count for posterity.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is The Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. A big thanks to Ann Nelson for joining us today. And we're going to link to her book, Shadow Network, on our website. We're going to zoom in on another shadowy political organization in just a moment. Stay with us. This is The Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We just heard about the influential Council for National Policy. Now we're going to pivot to another organization lurking in the shadows, and that's the Alliance Defending Freedom, or ADF. The ADF has been instrumental in the recent multi-million-dollar effort targeting both LGBTQ plus rights and abortion rights across the U.S. And yet most people still don't know about the ADF. For more on this, we're joined by R.G. Cravens, Senior Research Analyst with the Southern Poverty Law Center's Intelligence Project. The SPLC is a civil rights nonprofit. Good morning, R.G.
Thank you.
I want to ask you right off the top, how did the Alliance Defending Freedom come to be? Is it a relatively new organization, would you say?
Well, actually, no. ADF was actually founded in the early 90s. I think ADF says that they were founded in 1994. Other researchers have kind of suggested maybe a date a couple of years earlier, just depending on how you want to contextualize or talk about, when they started their activity versus when they maybe got a tax designation, right? But it's the early 1990s, so they've been around for quite a while. It was originally called then the Alliance Defense Fund, and its founders include several prominent members of the Christian right, names like Alan Sears, who was the longtime leader of ADF, James Dobson, a focus on the family, D. James Kennedy, Bill Bright from Campus Crusade for Christ, and then Don Wildman of the American Family Association, and others were part of that group. And I can maybe talk about it a little more in another question, but the group changed its name in 2012 to Alliance Defending Freedom, and like I said, there may be some reasons for that I could get into, but that's a little history, right, of the organization.
So just help me briefly understand how we might find the Alliance Defending Freedom sort of out in the wild. Does the organization focus on both legal advocacy and training? What do they do?
Sure. I think that's a good way to sum up what they would consider their mission: legal advocacy and training. They are largely a legal group, a litigious group, if you will, right? They file a lot of litigation, handle a lot of cases, appear before different courts, and have gone before the Supreme Court. They also have legal training projects, like you mentioned, where they bring in attorneys for training sessions. One particularly known as Blackstone happens usually in the summer. It's a several-week program where they recruit law students from across the country, not just from sort of conservative Christian law schools, but lots of different law schools, to come in and sort of learn about, right, the mission of the organization, and to sort of contextualize what they're doing, and bring in what they would consider to be a biblical worldview to the practice of law. But they are largely a legal group. That doesn't mean they don't do other things.
And they've had they've been associated with several people that have notoriety, right? Like an Amy Coney Barrett in that kind of a project, correct?
Sure, that's right. So Justice Barrett was, some reports have shown, right, a paid speaker for that Blackstone legal fellowship program prior to becoming a justice on the Supreme Court. Yeah, so there's lots of connections to government officials, to the executive branch and legislative branch. As I was saying, they appear at hearings, often testifying, whether it's in Congress or in state legislatures as well. And they've been known to write model legislation and share that within some of these networks, policy networks that seek to pass restrictive abortion measures or anti-LGBTQ legislation.
I want to ask you about the name, Alliance Defending Freedom. And I got to ask you, freedom for whom? Who are these people defending freedom for?
Sure. So there's a couple of answers to the question. One is sort of more of a high level, like, I don't know, academic take on why they changed their name, right, from the Alliance Defense Fund to Alliance Defending Freedom. But I guess we could sort of focus in on this notion that that there are cases that sort of point to ADF's own definition of who freedom sort of applies to, right? where a lot of the cases that ADF has taken, whether that's recent ones like the 303 Creative case or maybe Masterpiece Cake Shop cases, which are these legal challenges to civil rights laws, which suggest that a conservative religious person might have a right to discriminate against LGBTQ folks, right? In the provision of services or in restaurants and shops and businesses. ADF has helped to draft bans on trans kids playing in school sports, right? And so you could certainly say that it's a limited notion of freedom, right? That applies largely to those who hold a conservative Christian interpretation or conservative interpretation of Christian scripture, right? Much of the anti-LGBTQ ideology that we know helps sustain and is sustained by white Christian nationalism and white supremacy. And so taken together, those ideologies seek to define who is and who isn't American based on characteristics like race and religion and sexuality and gender, with typically white, straight, cisgender Christians being the prototype or the standard, right, of who is American and who is worthy of benefits and protection of the state. And so if that's your view, then others who aren't part of that prototypical group are not only undeserving of the same benefits you receive, but can also be subject to sanctions or suppression to either, change them into what you want them to be or eliminate them from the public sphere altogether. And so that, I think, is what we're seeing more of today as these legal and policy efforts are penetrating into local communities and Main Street. So the ideologies that ADF sort of represents are penetrating into more of our everyday lives, talking about censorship of LGBTQ and anti-racist teaching materials and attacks on public institutions, right? Seeking to limit the participation of folks who aren't that prototype in American society.
I just want to ask you the role of the ADF in the recent attacks on trans rights across the United States. I just got into it a little bit there, but can you expand upon it?
As far back as around 2013, 14, some of the groups that SPLC follows have been coordinating with messages and legal strategies to roll back LGBTQ rights, broadly speaking, and to really use transgender people to do that, to sort of focus in on trans folks and their rights as a way to divide the LGBTQ community and their allies, and push for restrictions, obviously on things like gender affirming care, but also participation in sports. And then we talk about censorship in libraries and schools and things. But it's also part of a broader campaign to really limit bodily autonomy or the ability to make decisions, right, about our own about our health outcomes, right? About our own medical care, for example, to really limit our bodily autonomy and limit the choices that we have that are more in line with their ideology, right? Which views often LGBTQ people again as sort of not part of American society, right? So
abortion, right? Abortion rights too. They might be involved with if you're considering bodily autonomy, that kind of thing.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. And on their website, right, ADF says that the law at the heart of the Supreme Court decision overturning Roe versus Wade was based on a model bill that they drafted in 2017. So they're very much, in that anti-abortion litigation camp as well. Yeah. What
did the election of Donald Trump mean for the ADF's influence in the U.S.?
It provided access, I think, to the executive branch, obviously. Right, there were reports of meetings between ADF attorneys and then Attorney General Jeff Sessions. The Department of Justice filed an amicus briefs in favor of ADF cases. The Trump administration rescinded some guidance, Obama-era guidance that interpreted Title IX to include gender identity protections, and ADF had, as I said, been litigating against that since it was announced in 2016. So there are several ways, I think, right, that the Trump administration provided access, right, to ADF and further helped to encode, right, their ideology into American policy.
Southern Poverty Law Center has designated the ADF as a hate group. Is that correct? Is that the right phrase that you all use?
Yeah, anti-LGBTQ hate group.
Anti-LGBTQ hate group. And some on the right have been critical of that. Is that how do you determine what is and isn't a hate group, and how do you come up with the terms? That's why I kind of wanted to get it right. How does this all come together?
Yeah, I appreciate it. So we define a hate group as an organization that, based on its official activities, beliefs, statements, principles, or practices, it attacks or maligns an entire class of people, typically because of their immutable or unchanging characteristics. And the organizations on our hate group list vilify others because of their race, their religion, their ethnicity, sexual orientation, or gender identity in this case. And these are prejudices that really strike at the heart of our democratic values, and they seek to fracture our society along some of its most fragile fault lines. ADF has spread myth and disinformation about the LGBTQ community. It's linked being LGBTQ to pedophilia, claimed that there's a homosexual agenda out to destroy society. As we mentioned, it tries to couch some of its rhetoric in benign sounding phrases, but the truth is that it really works to dehumanize LGBTQ people and restrict their rights for being who they are.
What do you think the role the ADF can have in our politics moving forward? Do you think its influence is going to continue to grow?
The group and a lot of groups that came about at that same time in the 80s and 90s, we only talked really about ADF, but there are several others right out there that still exist, who were founded at this time to push American politics to the hard right. And they have connections to organizations and individuals that have questioned the 2020 presidential election and have advocated voter suppression tactics. And I think these things, these are important to recognize because a lot of the rhetoric and especially anti-LGBTQ rhetoric that's happening and we're seeing really proliferate. A lot of that is detrimental to LGBTQ people and to our society. Attacks on our shared civil institutions, things like undermining public education, pursuing policies whose effect is to restrict access to public spaces by marginalized groups, or even restricting access to medical care, restricting freedom of expression like drag bans. All of these things help to erode pluralism. And that's what makes our multiracial democracy work. And so I think the effect is broader than just what happens in one election. It's really a question of recognizing when democracy is in danger and working to shore up our democratic norms and our values of diversity and pluralism.
A big thanks to R.G. Cravens for joining us today. Today's show was produced by Meg Dalton. Technical producers are Katie Tolarski and Kat Pastor. Special thanks to our interns, Stacey Addo and Carol Chen. Download The Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. Thanks for listening.